Waking up in the ICU with a breathing tube down my throat, my only focus was surviving. But the very first thing my trembling hands unlocked wasn't a get well text. It was a $15,000 fraud alert. While surgeons were literally cutting me open to stop septic shock, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law were in the hospital waiting room, raiding my private purse and booking an ultra-luxury presidential cruise to the Bahamas. They gambled that if I died, the debt would vanish, and if I survived, family guilt would force my silence. Even my spineless husband begged me to let it go. They severely underestimated me. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I simply dialed my bank's fraud division directly from my hospital pillow and submitted my surgical timestamps. 2 weeks later, when armed port officers cornered them at the VIP departure gate, their stolen paradise turned into absolute and irreversible public ruin. My name is Emily, I'm 28 years old, and until last month, I genuinely believed that family was sacred. I spent my entire 20s building a career as an independent software consultant, pulling 60-hour workweeks to ensure financial stability before marrying Mark. I loved him, but marrying Mark meant inheriting his family, his mother, Brenda, and his younger sister, Chloe. From the day we got engaged, Brenda treated my personal finances like an open community fund, while Chloe believed luxury was her birthright simply for existing. Mark never had the backbone to tell them no, constantly excusing their predatory demands under the guise of keeping the peace. I maintained strict financial boundaries by keeping my corporate accounts strictly separate, but I never imagined how far their entitlement could reach until the night my body completely gave out. It started on a Tuesday evening with what felt like routine stomach cramps, but within hours, the pain escalated into blinding, feverish agony. I collapsed on our kitchen floor, drenched in a cold sweat, barely able to draw breath. By the time the ambulance arrived, my appendix had fully ruptured, flooding my system with toxins and sending me spiraling into acute septic shock. Mark rode with me in the ambulance, panicking as the paramedics barked vitals and pumped fluids into my collapsing veins. When we arrived at the trauma center, I was slipping in and out of consciousness, watching the blinding fluorescent lights blur overhead as a surgical team rushed my gurney straight toward the operating theater. Before they wheeled me through the emergency double doors, Mark took charge of my personal effects, my phone, my car keys, and my leather handbag containing my primary identification and private business cards. Just as the medical team prepared to sedate me, Brenda and Chloe arrived at the hospital waiting area. Instead of comforting a terrified husband whose wife was hanging on to life by a thread, Brenda immediately took charge of the situation, insisting that Mark follow the lead surgeon down the hall to finalize authorization forms while she and Chloe watched over my belongings. Mark handed my purse over without a single second thought. Left entirely unsupervised in that waiting room while doctors fought to stabilize my vitals on the operating table, Brenda unzipped my bag, reached into the concealed inner sleeve, and pulled out my black titanium business card. While medical staff fought for my survival, my in-laws were already planning their grand theft. Waking up in the intensive care unit felt like clawing my way through thick fog. The steady, rhythmic beeps of heart monitors and the sterile hiss of oxygen tubes filled the quiet room. Every inch of my abdomen burned with deep surgical pain, and moving even an inch sent sharp tremors through my core. As my vision slowly sharpened, I reached toward the plastic bedside table where a nurse had set my personal phone. I had no idea how many hours or days had slipped past while I was under anesthesia, but the moment my screen lit up, my stomach dropped through the floor. A relentless cascade of high-priority notifications flashed across the glass. They weren't just missed calls from concerned friends or work emails. They were fraud alerts directly from my corporate banking app. 3 consecutive, massive transactions had cleared while I was lying unconscious on the operating table. The merchant line read clear as day: Royal Caribbean Suites and Packages. Total charges: exactly $15,000. My heart rate spiked, causing the bedside monitor to chirp an erratic warning. With shaking fingers, I pulled my leather handbag from the small hospital locker nearby and unzipped the concealed inner pocket. My black titanium corporate card, a private account solely in my name, carrying a zero balance limit for business operations, was gone. All of our shared debit cards and my everyday personal items sat untouched. This hadn't been a random, careless snatch. It was a targeted, calculated theft. Right then, the door swung open, and Mark walked in carrying a paper cup of lukewarm coffee. He looked relieved to see my eyes open, but that relief vanished the second I turned the glowing screen directly toward his face. I didn't raise my voice. The sheer coldness in my tone startled him. When I demanded an immediate explanation, Mark didn't look shocked or outraged. Instead, he shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my direct gaze. He nervously mumbled that Brenda had broken down crying in the waiting room while the surgeons were working on me. She had convinced him that the immense emotional trauma of nearly losing a daughter-in-law justified a restorative family getaway to heal their fractured nerves. Mark had known all along, standing by while his mother and sister casually looted my bank account while I was fighting for my life. I stared at my husband in utter disbelief, the sterile hospital room feeling colder by the second. I gave Mark one single, unequivocal chance to fix what his family had done. I told him to call his mother right that second, make her cancel the reservation, and return the stolen card before the day ended. But instead of backing his critically ill wife, Mark bristled. He crossed his arms, glared down at my hospital bed, and accused me of being cold-hearted, obsessive, and hopelessly transactional. He insisted that Brenda and Chloe deserved grace during such an emotionally fraught time, asking why I had to bring up money when I had just survived a major surgical ordeal. That was the exact moment the final thread holding my marriage together snapped. I didn't yell. I didn't shed a single tear. I calmly looked away, reached over to silence the beeping for pump, and pressed the speed dial for my private client representative at the fraud division of my bank. When the agent picked up, I kept my voice steady and distinct, ignoring Mark's frantic waving gestures as his face drained of color. I stated my full legal name, verified my security credentials, and clearly declared a case of unauthorized identity theft and grand larceny. I explained that an illicit charge of $15,000 had been executed against my corporate account without my consent or presence. The representative immediately opened a priority fraud investigation file. To ensure there was zero ambiguity, I authorized the release of my hospital admission logs and surgical operating records. The digital timestamp of the transaction proved beyond any legal doubt that the cruise had been booked at the exact hour I was intubated under general anesthesia on an operating table, completely incapable of authorizing a payment. When the bank representative asked if I wanted to initiate merchant mediation to give the cardholder time to settle the balance amicably, my answer was instant and uncompromising. Absolutely not. I requested an immediate chargeback, total account cancellation, and the transmission of a verified fraud report to the merchant's corporate fraud enforcement team. I officially flagged the transaction as felonious card theft. By the time I hung up the phone, Mark was practically hyperventilating by my bedside, begging me to reconsider. But the gears of the legal and financial system were already spinning, and there was nothing on earth that could stop what was coming for Brenda and Chloe. Over the next 2 weeks of my recovery at home, an eerie, smug silence settled over the household. Brenda and Chloe never once visited me to see how I was healing from the surgery, nor did they send a single text checking on my health. Instead, my social media feed became a daily gallery of their insufferable entitlement. Every single morning, Chloe uploaded photos flaunting designer beachwear, luxury resort luggage, and expensive sun hats, captioning the posts with smug phrases about counting down the days to their VIP family getaway and manifesting pure luxury. Brenda chimed in on every comment section, dropping passive-aggressive remarks about how her devoted son Mark always ensured the real women of the family were treated like royalty. Mark walked around our house with an insufferable swagger, completely convinced that he had successfully managed the entire ordeal. Because I had deliberately maintained a calm, quiet demeanor since leaving the hospital, he assumed I had quietly swallowed the $15,000 loss to preserve our domestic peace. He thought I was too tired, too physically depleted, and too cowardly to enforce any real consequences. He had no idea that my silence wasn't surrender, it was tactical patience. Behind the scenes, my bank's fraud department had quietly finalized the investigation. The chargeback had been formally executed, Reversing the funds directly from the cruise line's accounts, and the corporate security division had flagged the reservation ID with a severe fraud and card trafficking alert. While Mark spent his evenings on the phone helping his sister coordinate excursions in the Bahamas, I spent my days quietly arranging my complete exit. I hired a private moving service, secured an extended-stay corporate suite under my own business name, and methodically packed all my personal belongings, high-value assets, and vital documents. I moved everything out while Mark was out of the house, leaving behind an empty closet, a bare nightstand, and a cold house. By Friday morning, the day of departure had finally arrived. Mark drove out early to escort his mother and sister to the port of Miami, where their ultra-luxury ship was waiting at the dock. Brenda and Chloe arrived at the terminal in matching outfits, carrying oversized sunglasses and champagne flutes, completely eager to bask in the high-class suite they thought they had successfully stolen from me. They believed they were about to embark on the vacation of a lifetime, totally oblivious to the fact that the digital tripwire had already been armed at the main boarding gate. The sun beat down on the Port of Miami terminal as Brenda and Chloe strutted past hundreds of waiting passengers, heading straight for the exclusive VIP priority boarding lane. Brenda carried herself like royalty, holding up her smartphone with an entitled smirk, practically daring anyone to get in her way. Mark trailed behind them with their oversized designer suitcases, laughing and soaking in the spectacle. They reached the sleek glass counter where a uniformed concierge agent greeted them with a professional smile, asking for their boarding passes and passports to complete the final check-in. Brenda proudly presented her phone, tapping the screen to display the reservation confirmation number for the presidential penthouse suite. The agent scanned the barcode. Instead of the familiar green chime and printing boarding passes, the terminal console let out a series of sharp, jarring red error beeps. The agent's smile vanished instantly. She frowned at the monitor, rapidly typed a command into the keyboard, and looked up at Brenda with a completely changed expression. The screen wasn't just showing a decline. It was flashing a high-priority system alert indicating the reservation was void due to disputed fraudulent payment and commanding staff to contact port security immediately. Brenda immediately became indignant, slamming her hand onto the counter and demanding to speak to the port director, screaming that she was a top-tier guest who refused to be inconvenienced by computer glitches. But within 90 seconds, the situation escalated beyond anything she could control. Two armed Port Authority officers, flanked by the cruise line's chief of terminal security, walked briskly toward the VIP desk and positioned themselves directly on either side of Brenda and Chloe. The security supervisor informed them in a calm, authoritative voice that the reservation had been formally revoked 2 weeks prior due to a sworn affidavit of felonious credit card theft and grand larceny. The cruise line had zero tolerance for fraudulent boarding attempts, and because the chargeback amount exceeded the felony threshold, port regulations required them to be immediately detained for an on-site law enforcement investigation. Chloe instantly burst into loud, hysterical tears as curious onlookers started pulling out their smartphones to record the entire humiliating spectacle. Brenda's face turned an awful shade of purple as the officers instructed them to leave their luggage behind and follow them toward the terminal security holding office for formal questioning. Mark stood frozen in total shock, dropping the suitcases onto the pavement as the gravity of what I had done finally crashed over him. As the security doors closed behind his mother and sister, Brenda snatched Mark's phone from his trembling hands and frantically dialed my number. When my phone lit up with Mark's caller ID in the quiet comfort of my new corporate suite, I knew the trap had finally snapped shut. I let the phone ring 4 times before sliding my finger across the glass and putting it on speaker. Instantly, a deafening wave of screeching and frantic shouting filled my quiet living room. Brenda's voice came through shrill and distorted, screaming that I was an evil, ungrateful monster who had ruined her life and destroyed their family's dignity. Behind her, I could hear Chloe weeping loudly, accompanied by the stern, echoing voices of Port Authority officers demanding they sit down and stay quiet inside the holding area. Mark grabbed the phone from his mother, his voice cracking with sheer panic. He begged me to fix it, pleading with me to immediately call the bank, withdraw the charges, and tell the port authorities that the entire incident had just been a harmless misunderstanding. He swore that if I dropped the fraud claim right that second, they would figure out a way to pay me back eventually. I took a slow sip of tea and answered in a voice as calm as ice. I told him that real life doesn't come with an undo button. I explained that when you commit grand larceny by stealing a black titanium business card from a woman lying unconscious in the intensive care unit, you don't get a friendly settlement. You get the full weight of the legal system. I reminded Brenda, who was still hollering in the background, that a sworn fraud affidavit filed alongside certified surgical records is a matter of state and federal banking law. I couldn't simply wave a wand and erase a felony report even if I wanted to, and I certainly didn't want to. The fallout was immediate and devastating. The cruise line's legal representatives refused entry to the ship entirely, formally placing Brenda and Chloe on a permanent, lifetime global ban across all partner cruise lines. Because the boarding attempt triggered acute security intervention, the cruise company imposed steep civil disruption penalties and demanded full payment for non-refundable terminal booking fees out of Brenda's own pocket. Port Authority officers documented every detail of the unauthorized transaction, issuing formal criminal warning citations and opening a direct file with local law enforcement. While the luxury ship pulled away from the dock without them, Brenda and Chloe were left sitting on the hard plastic chairs of the security annex, completely humiliated in front of terminal staff. Mark tried one last desperate plea, asking how I could be so heartless to my own family. I looked down at the empty room around me, smiled quietly, and told him that my family was no longer his concern before hanging up for the very last time. Within 48 hours of that phone call, Mark arrived back at our empty marital home to find a certified process server waiting on the porch. The divorce petition was clean, swift, and non-negotiable. Thanks to the meticulous prenuptial agreement and the completely separate business structures I had established long before our wedding, there were no messy financial battles to fight. I legally severed every shared account, removed Mark as the beneficiary from my insurance policies and corporate estate, and formally terminated the lease on the house, giving him 30 days to pack what little was left and move back in with his mother. Brenda, true to her narcissistic nature, refused to go down quietly. The very next week, she launched an online crowdfunding campaign, framing herself and Chloe as innocent victims of a spiteful daughter-in-law and a heartless corporate giant. She fabricated an elaborate sob story about being wrongfully detained and stranded at the port, pleading for $10,000 from friends and extended family to cover their mounting legal expenses and port civil disruption fines. Her smear campaign lasted less than 24 hours. Rather than engaging in a petty social media shouting match, I simply published a single, public post containing the cold, undeniable facts. I attached the hospital admission timestamp proving I was under general anesthesia during the transaction, the itemized $15,000 cruise booking receipt under Chloe's name, and the formal bank fraud investigation report. The reaction across the entire extended family was instantaneous. Relatives who had initially sympathized with Brenda flooded the comments with outrage, rescinding their donations and publicly calling her out for attempting to rob a critically ill family member in the ICU. The sheer embarrassment forced Brenda to delete all her social media accounts within the week. Today, my health is completely restored, and my life has never felt lighter. With the fraud charges finalized and my financial slate wiped entirely clean, I used the very funds Brenda tried to steal to book my own private wellness retreat in the Swiss Alps. Standing on a mountain balcony surrounded by crisp, quiet air and absolute peace, I realized that surviving that emergency room ordeal had given me far more than just a second chance at life. It gave me the clarity and strength to cut away the parasitic dead weight holding me down. I walked out of the ICU with a healed body, a thriving business, and the priceless freedom of knowing that nobody would ever take advantage of me again.